Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, if it's morning where you are, and welcome to this Orkney International Science Festival lecture. The title, Maxwell's Light, doesn't mean very much to a lot of people. You might ask, who was this guy Maxwell, and what was he doing with light? Well, James Clerk Maxwell was one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, period. He's ranked alongside people like Newton and Einstein, but he's not very well known even in his own country. In 1865, he unified the theories of electricity and magnetism and showed that light consisted of electromagnetic waves. This work would lead to wireless communication, radio, television, and a host of other inventions. There is a statue to him at the east end of George Street in Edinburgh, if you go there. The statue includes Toby, his dog. He always had a dog, and it was always called Toby, and it often went to work with him. In 2015, his work on light was recognized by no less than the United Nations when they declared 2019 the International Year of Light, 150 years after the key paper that Maxwell had published. Now, in 2014, Howie had suggested that there should be a special torch, a Maxwell torch created rather like an Olympic torch for the Year of Light, and it should appear at science festival events and other such events all over the country in 2015. We approached a company in Lowenhead called Mike Stone Lighting, and they very kindly designed and built the torch, and here it is, using the latest LED technology. And the image on the right here shows it in the stables at Glenlair when I took it there in 2015. Glenlair was Maxwell's home for most of his life. Now we're going to be sampling some songs tonight. These songs are based on poetry that Maxwell wrote. He was very musical. He was very fond of the poems of Burns in particular, and he wrote some poems on his own. And these have been set to music by Andy Monroe, and we're going to sample a few of these tonight. If you like the songs, then you can buy the audio CD from the Orkney Science Festival shop online. So that's the end of the TV commercial. We're going to have a tour of Glenlair, a virtual tour of Glenlair, with the current owner, Duncan Ferguson, later today at lunchtime. That's well worth watching. Now, to go back to the beginning, James Clerk Maxwell was born in this house in India Street in 1831. He was the only child of John Clark of Pennycook, an Edinburgh lawyer, and Frances Kay from Northumberland. If you go there today, you'll see a plaque by the door that lists some of his achievements. And they've had some fairly ham-fisted visitors because they've had to put a notice on the doorbell to say, please pull it gently. The house is now owned and occupied and run by a charitable trust, of which I am a trustee. In the front room on the ground floor, there is what might be called a Maxwell Museum with various portraits and some examples of his original apparatus that have been preserved. It can be visited by arrangement. It's not generally open to the public. Shortly after James was born, the family moved to a new house that they had built at Glenlair, which is near Castle Douglas in Dumfries and Galloway. Beautiful location. And this became the home of James Clerk Maxwell, really for the rest of his life. As a child, it became obvious that he was amazingly talented, very intelligent, what we'd now call a child prodigy. He was always asking how things worked. His favorite question was, what's the go of that? And if he wasn't happy with the answer, he would say, yes, but what's the particular go of it? He was fascinated by light and color. He often played with mirrors and shone sunlight into dark corners of the room. At an early age, he was able to dismantle door locks, mechanical locks, and he could reassemble them, which is pretty amazing. He liked to walk in the woods by the water and just sit quietly observing nature. He was educated at home by his parents, which in practice meant mostly his mother. It was a broad education. His father was a very practical guy, and he learned a lot of practical skills making things with his dad. He also worked on the farm at busy times. He learned how to handle horses and farm implements. He played with local children, which meant he had a strong Galloway accent, which stayed with him for the rest of his life. He had inherited genius from both sides of the family, from the Clark family and the Kay family. If you want to read more about this, I can recommend this book, Brilliant Lives, by one of my former colleagues, John Arthur. The two families, the Clarks and the Kays, between them have produced 12 Fellows of the Royal Society. A pretty amazing record. So what sort of person was James Clerk Maxwell? Well, he was a very modest, quiet, warm-hearted man. He had a great sense of humor. He was deeply religious, but he didn't try to force that on anyone else. He was fond of nature and animals. He was what we call nowadays a polymath. He excelled at everything he turned his hand to. He was an experimenter. He was always building things to try things out. He was interested in music. I mentioned he liked the poetry of Burns. He had a prodigious memory, and he could recite large tracts of Burns' poetry from memory, and also large passages of scripture from the Bible. And he wrote his own poems, some of which we'll be hearing later. So how could we summarize his scientific achievements? Well, undoubtedly the most important one, which I'll expand on later, was what he called the undulatory nature of light, that light is a wave phenomenon. And this has been described as one of the greatest leaps ever made in human thought. He analyzed the structure of the rings of Saturn theoretically and predicted what they were correctly, but this would not be confirmed until one of the Voyager satellites passed close by Saturn and confirmed that Maxwell was right. He worked on the kinetic theory of gases while he was in Aberdeen, and he continued his investigation of color with great effect. He built apparatus to measure the response of the human eye to color, and he produced the first color photograph when he was at King's College in 1861. Shortly after that, he left King's College and went back to Glenlair to work on his light theory. He then returned to Cambridge in 1871 and set up a research lab called the Cavendish Lab, and that research lab is still there to this day. And he achieved all this in a life of only 48 years. Now, this outline that I've just given you has been summarized in a new song called James Clerk Maxwell. The words are by Howie, and we're going to hear it now, performed by Andy and Flora Monroe, with a video by Selena.
Oh, tell me, please, the story of a boy who dreamed of the sea, who grew up in the fields of Galloway, and the man that he grew to be, and the road that he came to travel for a sight of a far country, as he looked for the light that was shining, and he dreamed of a distant sea. And he walked in the woods by the water, with the light on the leaves from the sun, and he looked at the morning colours through the dewdrops one by one, and he wondered, always wondered, where the source of the light could be. and he thought of the path through the rainbow, and he dreamed of a distant sea.
Now, I mentioned that he was living at home, being educated at home, mostly by his mother. This happy situation sadly came to an end when he was only 8 years old. His mother died of cancer. His father decided that he would hire a private tutor to continue his education at home. This seemed like a good idea. Unfortunately, the person that he chose as the tutor was a bit of a tyrant, and he and James did not get on at all. And after a couple of years, James had had enough, and one day he rebelled, and he ran from the house to the duck pond. There he launched himself in a wash tub that he used as a boat and went out into the middle of the pond and refused to come ashore, while the tutor ranted and raved and tried to haul him ashore with a rake. The scene was captured in this cartoon by James's cousin, Jemima Wedderburn, who was a very gifted artist, and she captured this sometime later. She drew this sometime later. But his father got the message that this was just not going to work. He decided he would have to send him to school. And he chose Edinburgh Academy, the Edinburgh Academy, as a well-known, very good school in Edinburgh, where he could live with his aunt, Jemima Wedderburn's mother, in Heriot Row. So he came to Edinburgh Academy. Sadly, things did not get off to a good start. His Galloway accent and his country ways meant that he was picked on and bullied by some of the boys. And he was nicknamed Dafty by some of them. How wrong they could be. But he soon settled in, and he became interested in the work of Descartes. He was fascinated with geometry. He wrote a paper about drawing ellipses and other curves, and this was accepted by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. However, when they found out he was only 14, they said, oh my goodness, no, we can't have him present this paper. So it was presented on his behalf by Professor Forbes from the University of Edinburgh. At school, he was a bit of a loner. He read a lot. He made mechanical models of everything. He was able to visualize things in 3 dimensions. And in a letter to his father, he said that he had made a tetrahedron, a dodecahedron, and 2 other hedrons that he didn't know the right names for. While at school, he became a good friend of Peter Guthrie Tait, who would go on to become a professor of natural philosophy, and they were friends for life. Now, if you go to the Edinburgh Academy today, at the right-hand side and slightly behind the main building, there's a modern science block, and it's been named the James Clerk Maxwell Science Centre after their most famous former pupil. But shortly after he left the Edinburgh Academy and was a student at Edinburgh University, he tried his hand at composing a school song. Now, this school song is not your typical school assembly item. It's more of a drinking song. And we don't know the reaction of the Edinburgh Academy to this, but this irreverent streak or the irreverent mindset, he may have inherited from his great uncle, John Clark of Eldon, who was a lawyer, a very famous lawyer. And it was said that when he was in an excited state in court, he was like a tornado. And the story's told that he once took a case all the way to the House of Lords. And this case concerned his client's right to operate a water mill and take water from a stream. Now, this kind of dispute was very common in Scotland because there were hundreds of water mills all over the country. And there were often disputes about rights to water. So he appeared at the House of Lords, and he was in an excited state. And he told the Lord Chamberlain and the Lordships that his client had always used the water from this burn. The water had been running there for centuries, and his client had every right to continue to use this water. At this point, the Lord Chamberlain interrupted him and said, Mr. Clark. Yes, my lord. Does one spell the word water with 2 T's? And as quick as a flash, he replied, no, my lord, but you would spell manners with 2 N's. And he still won the case. So here we have a wee sample of the school song being sung by Andy Monroe and friends.
If any here has got an ear, he better tack a had of me, or I'll begin with roaring din to cheer our old academy.
Dear old academy, queer old academy, a merry lot me where I was when at the old academy.
You get the idea. In 1847, James left the academy, aged 16, and he went to the University of Edinburgh to study natural philosophy under Professor Forbes. At this time, he had set up a laboratory and workshop in the wash house at Glenlair, and he did a lot of work building batteries and working on the polarization of light. He discovered photoelasticity and wrote a paper for the Royal Society at this time. But in 1850, when he graduated from Edinburgh, he moved to Cambridge, and there he met William Thomson, later to be Lord Kelvin, whose work on heat conduction would later inspire him in his work on light waves. But when he was at Cambridge, he met Michael Faraday. Now, Michael Faraday had done tremendous work on electricity and magnetism. He had described the forces between magnets. But if you think about it, magnets are fairly spooky things that there's nothing between, but there is a force between them. And he described these tentacles between magnets as lines of force. And I'm sure you've done this experiment with iron filings on a sheet of card. There's a similar situation with electric charges in space. They are either attracted or repelled from each other, and there are lines of force of electric field between them. Now, Faraday realized that he needed to be able to calculate the force on a particle at any point in space around either a magnet or a charged particle. And he did not have that mathematical ability, but he knew that Maxwell did. And Maxwell was able to visualize it in 3 dimensions, if you remember the hadrons, and he came up with an expression for the force on a particle anywhere in space around another one. In a static case, nothing's moving here. And in 1854, he was well on the way to sorting this out. But although things were going well in his research career, he had a bit of a personal setback at this time, because during a family holiday in the Lake District, he'd fallen in love with his cousin, Elizabeth. But the families decided that cousins should not marry and the relationship had to end. So he came back from the Lake District in a rather depressed state. He walked all the way back from the Lake District to Glenlair. And he wrote a poem describing his black mood, how he was so depressed, and then how his love of nature and music and his religious faith saw him through it. He specified it should be sung to the air of Lorelei, which is a very old German folk song tune. And he would have known this well. So we're now going to sample this sung by Flora, accompanied by Andy. It starts, alone on a hillside of heather, I lay with dark thoughts in my mind.
Alone on a hillside of heather, of the beautiful weather. I was deaf, I was dumb, I was blind. I knew not the glories around me. I counted the world as it seems, till the spirit of melody found me and taught me in visions and dreams.
Well, that was just one verse of the song. You can hear the rest on the CD. Now, things were about to get even worse in his personal life before they got better, because in late 1855, his father was taken ill, and James returned from Cambridge to look after him. He was thinking of applying for a vacant post at Marischal College in Aberdeen, and he discussed this with his father as whether he should do it or not. And his father encouraged him to apply because he said, it'll only occupy you for half the year anyway, and you'll be a lot closer to Glenlair. So he decided to apply. But sadly, his father died at Easter 1856, just before James moved to Marischal College in Aberdeen. After Cambridge, he found the Aberdonians a pretty humorless and dour lot. He told in a letter to one of his former colleagues, he said, "No jokes of any kind are understood here. I've not made one for 2 months, and if I feel one coming on, I'll bite my tongue." While he was at Aberdeen, he worked on the rings of Saturn. This was a major theoretical analysis of what they might be made of. He worked on the kinetic theory of gases. And more importantly, he met the daughter of the principal of Marischal College, Catherine Dewar, who was several years his senior. They fell in love, and they were married in 1858. His teaching methods at Aberdeen had ruffled a few feathers, because at that time, the sons of the well-to-do gentry sometimes took their manservants to Aberdeen University to look after them. And they would have their manservants do the practical work in the labs. Maxwell decided this was stupid, and they had to do the practical work themselves in order to learn, and he banned the manservants from the labs. There were complaints made to the principal, but guess what? They never got any further. But in 1860, the two colleges in Aberdeen, Marischal College and King's College, decided to merge to create the University of Aberdeen. And there was only space for one professor of natural philosophy. And guess what? It was not Maxwell. It was given to one called Crafty Thompson. And so he was out of a job, essentially. There was a vacancy in Edinburgh, which he applied for, but in fact, his great friend from school, Peter Tate, was given the post instead on the grounds that he was perhaps a better lecturer. However, there was a vacancy at King's College in London, so James and Catherine went to London. There he continued his work on colour perception, which he'd started in Aberdeen, in particular, how the eye responds to colour. And he'd shown that with the three primary colours, red, green, and blue, if they were mixed in different intensities, then different colours could be created. So he figured out a way of making a colour photograph, because photography was making great strides at that time, and really quite good quality glass plates were available with silver halide emulsion. So he reckoned that if he took a camera and put a green filter in front of the lens and took a picture with it, then the light and dark areas in the negative corresponded to the green parts of the object. Likewise for blue, likewise for red. If these were then made into positive slides and put into slide projectors. And if the slide projectors had the same red, green, and blue filters in front of them, then when the images were overlaid on a screen, provided the images were all the same size and were perfectly in registration, it should recreate the object. And indeed it did. And this was demonstrated at the Royal Institution in London in 1861 to gasps of amazement. And he was helped greatly in this by a photographer at King's College called Thomas Sutton, who would go on to invent the single lens reflex camera. For those of you who used to do photography with reflex cameras, that was a big step forward. Now let's return to Faraday's work. James had done an analysis of magnetic fields and electric fields for the static case. He thought, well, nothing is ever static. Things are vibrating. If they have a real temperature, they must be vibrating. So what if the charges that we're talking about here are vibrating? Then we would have a dynamic electric field, and a particle some distance away would experience an undulating force due to the vibration of another particle. And it would feel perhaps as if a wave was going past, because the force would be going up and down. Now, what about the magnetic effects? Well, Ørsted in Denmark had come up with a means of checking for magnetic fields using a compass needle. And he'd shown that when there is a current flowing through a wire, there is a magnetic field at right angles to it. And when the current direction is reversed, the magnetic field reverses. So James reckoned that with these vibrating charges, what we have is an alternating current. It's changing direction regularly. So there must be an alternating magnetic field associated with it. And he then made this tremendous leap in human thought and said, yes, there must be a pair of linked transverse waves, one electric and one magnetic, an electromagnetic wave, which will travel through space. Now, the electrical properties and the magnetic properties of space had been measured using capacitors and inductors. And these two fundamental constants, epsilon naught and mu naught, had been evaluated numerically. So he said, okay, the speed of travel of this wave through space will be 1 over the square root of epsilon naught mu naught. And he came up with this number, which is 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, 300,000 kilometers per second, which is an awfully big number. And straight away, he said, aha, this could well be light. Because he said, this velocity is so nearly that of light that it seems we have strong reason to conclude that light itself, including radiant heat and other radiations, is an electromagnetic disturbance in the form of waves propagated through the electromagnetic field according to electromagnetic laws. Now, Fizeau had measured the speed of light experimentally at 313,000 kilometers a second. So it wasn't far off, it was about 5% off. Did he shout this from the rooftops? No. But in a letter to his cousin, he said, I have also a paper afloat with an electromagnetic theory of light, which, till I'm convinced to the contrary, I hold to be great guns. That's the closest he ever got to saying whoopee or eureka. We now know, of course, that visible light is just a very small part of an enormous spectrum going from long-wave radio waves down to gamma rays and nuclear radiation. Now, in 1871, he returned to Cambridge as the Cavendish Professor of Experimental Physics. Now, I've underlined the word experimental because a lot of people say that Maxwell was a purely theoretical scientist. This is completely wrong. He was a very practical guy who did practical experiments by the thousand. In 1873, he wrote a textbook on electricity and magnetism. And in 1874, he set up the Cavendish Laboratory. The money had been put up by Henry Cavendish, the Duke of Devonshire, and hence it was named the Cavendish Lab. And it's a centre of excellence in research to this very day. So far, it has produced 29 Nobel Prize winners, one of whom was a farmer's son from Pennycook, again, Charles Wilson, who had invented the cloud chamber and was awarded the Nobel Prize for it in 1927. But James's career was about to be cut short by illness. As in later life, he had written a poem in which he likened a human life, his life, to the course of a river, from the rushing, tumbling currents of youth to the slowing down in middle age, and then at the end, when it's all over, flowing into the sea. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, may have read this when he wrote in 1955, and I'll quote this here: "An individual human existence should be like a river, small at first, narrowly contained within its banks, and rushing passionately past boulders and over waterfalls. Gradually, the river grows wider, the banks recede, the waters flow more quietly, and in the end, without any visible break, they become merged in the sea and painlessly lose their individual being. The man or woman who in old age can see his or her life in this way will not suffer from the fear of death, since the things they care for will continue." We're now going to hear this poem set to music, a well-known tune, and it's going to be sung by Flora.
I've heard the rushing of mountain torrents gushing down through the rocks in a cataract of spray, onward to the ocean. Swift seemed their motion, till lost in the desert they dwindled away. I've learned the story of all human glory. I felt high resolves growing weaker every day, till care springing round me with creeping tendrils bound me, and all I once hoped for was wearing fast away. desert arid, its waters never tarried till far out at sea we still found them on their way. Now no more weary, we faint in deserts dreary, toiling alone till the closing of the day. All now is righted, our souls flow on united till the years and their sorrows have all died away.
In 1879, James was diagnosed with the same type of cancer that had taken his mother 40 years before. He and Catherine spent the summer at Glenlair and then returned to Cambridge in the autumn. He was very ill at this stage, and he was visited by colleagues from the university. He told one of them, "I've been thinking how very gently I've always been dealt with. I've never had a violent shove in all my life. The only desire which I can have is, like David, to serve my own generation by the will of God and then fall asleep." He died in Cambridge on the 5th of November, 1879. And in accordance with his wishes, his body was brought back to Glenlair and he was buried beside his parents in the kirkyard at Parton nearby. If you go there today, you can find the grave. It's a very plain headstone. It makes no mention of his academic career or anything. It's his parents' names and dates of death and his widow's. There is, however, on the Kirk Green, beside the War Memorial, a more modern monument with a plaque put there by the James Clerk Maxwell Foundation. That's the plaque there, and this is a transcript. I'm not going to read it all. The first part refers to his scientific career. The middle paragraph lists his contributions to science. And for me, the most important bit is in fact the last sentence, which says, "A good man, full of humour, he lived in this area and is buried in the ruins of the old kirk in this churchyard." Now, several years after his death in 1886, Heinrich Hertz in Germany decided to see if he could use Maxwell's waves and detect them at a distance. So he set up this spark generator, which is a bit like a car ignition system, but on steroids. And the idea was that it would produce Maxwell's waves from these plate-type antennae. He thought that if he had a loop antenna with a tiny gap between the ends of it, if he produced an enormous alternating current from his spark generator, he might be able to detect the waves at a distance by seeing if there was a small spark between the ends of the loop of wire. So that is indeed what happened. He had an enormous blue spark at his transmitter and a very, very feeble spark at the antenna. Would you like to see that again? There we are. He was asked if this had any application, and he said none whatsoever, but it did prove that Professor Maxwell was right and Maxwell's waves were real. However, Marconi saw the potential of this when it came to communicating with ships, because the electric telegraph using wires had basically covered most of the world, but communicating with ships was a big problem. And within a few years of the turn of the century, he had set up wireless telegraphy with transmitting stations all over the world, simple detectors, and he was able to send text messages. And the rest is history, as to say. Now, there are many tributes to Maxwell after his death. Oliver Heavyside, who was a fellow physicist and simplified Maxwell's equations for the wave nature of light, he said, his soul will live and grow for long to come, and hundreds of years hence will shine as one of the bright stars of the past, whose light takes ages to reach us. What he meant here was that Maxwell's work was so profound that it would take many years before all the applications for it were found. And Einstein, on the centenary of Maxwell's birth in 1931, described his work as most profound and the most fruitful that physics has experienced since the time of Newton. So what's his legacy been to us, to the general public, to the man in the street? Well, in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell had produced the first telephone. It looked rather like this. That was in Maxwell's time. We now have smartphones, which rely very much on the work of Maxwell, not just for the communication, but for other things, particularly the camera and the display. Likewise, our computers with color displays, our printers with color, all use that technology. Radio waves give us radio and television. So I'm hoping that the next time you watch television or use your phone or take a photograph, that you remember and give thanks to this wee boy from the Galloway Hills, who always wondered how things worked, who walked in the woods by the water, and went on to make such a contribution to our lives today. James Clerk Maxwell. Thank you.